Founders of Alexandria. By Star Scribe. Part 7. Founders. Chapter 5. Oliver had never invested more of himself in a patient than he did in little Alex. In school, he'd been taught over and over about the necessity of detachment. Any personal investment in a patient would destroy his impartiality and create a conflict of interest. Fundamentally, he was to be a scientific technician, compassionate only to the degree it was required for his bedside manner. That detachment had not survived the end of the world. His friends were so rare now, too precious to let death claim. Even the friend he'd thought would never need his care. Especially her. Little Alex had been a dozen things to Oliver since they'd first met. She'd been the first pony he met after months of isolation. She'd been the first, and only, who enjoyed singing with him. Her alto sounded wonderful with his tenor, even if she wasn't nearly as good or interested in gardening. She'd been a friend, a leader, a pony he'd started to sometimes think about in ways that made him uncomfortable, and finally a martyr. Or rather, she'd tried to be. Her body was always finding new ways to try and die. He refused to let that happen. He'd lost track of the surgeries he'd performed, the hundreds of different drugs he'd had to use at one point or another. He'd worked until his magic was exhausted and he couldn't lift his legs. He'd worked so long on some nights that he forgot to eat, with only the unconscious pony and the medical monitors for company. He was vaguely conscious things were changing in Alexandria, but he didn't really notice unless the changes made it to the hospital. He never left anymore, not even to tend his garden. The winter would have claimed most of it anyway by now. Death could have his flowers so long as he could keep his friends. Oliver only left Alex's room to shower and to eat, and even then he didn't go far. He'd turned the room next door into his living quarters, though he barely visited. For pleasure he read only the equestrian medical books, at least the digital ones he had. If the answer to how to help his friend was in the other books, it was inaccessible. An unconscious Alex could not open the library. Occasionally ponies came to visit him. He usually took them in Alex's room, so long as his single patient wasn't trying out a new way to die. Yet he couldn't listen for long without his mind drifting, and they all left before they stayed an hour. The only member of the Alexandria colony who spent more time with fallen Alex was her dog, Huan. The loyal canine never left her side, except on his brief forays downstairs for food or to use the bathroom outside. Only the medical needs of ponies could break through his haze. Under that auspice he could hear and understand again. Then he could learn the news of the city while they spoke. At those times, little Riley acted as his receptionist and nurse both, though she no longer looked like herself. She was still black, her mane still electric blue, but she'd given up the holes and the chitin and the wings too. It was an impressive trick, though Oliver wasn't sure why she needed it and hadn't cared enough to ask. It was she who interrupted him that day, her jacket tied about her and a clipboard hovering in her green magic. Oliver thought she looked quite convincing, though he also knew she doodled pictures of ponies kissing on it and used it for no other reason than to look like she knew what she was doing. "Hey Oliver!" She poked him with her clipboard, bringing him crashing back to the real world. "Ponies here to see you." Joseph dislocated his pelvis again, he asked, exasperated. "Maybe one of the odium ponies cut a fetlock open on a can." She giggled. Riley might not have made herself look any older with that strange magic of hers, but at least she appreciated his jokes. Not either. "They're part of the last group to come in. Last night, actually. She tried to bring her sick foal and then, but I knew you were busy, so." He had been restarting Alex's heart last night. It took him so much magic that he thought he would shrivel up like a prune. He hadn't. Yet. "I was." He sighed, beginning to remove his gloves. Wearing rubber gloves over hooves didn't really do much good, but he kept at it because he didn't know any better. He tossed his in the trash, along with the mask he had been wearing. "You'll get me if anything happens." Quicker than lightning, Riley agreed, levitating a fresh pair of gloves onto her hooves. She wouldn't do anything but doodle, but he didn't mind. For an 11-year-old, the changeling had become remarkably disciplined in the few short weeks she had been helping him. Oliver shrugged, then hurried out of the room before he changed his mind. He had to compose himself. There had apparently been more immigrants, or at least visitors, making this the third group to arrive. Or were they the fourth? He had lost track. He had to go down a hallway and through a set of swinging doors to reach the clinic, the only other area with any lights on. It was also the only area with heat, which meant he had to cross what Riley called the Great Air Ice River. He didn't really understand what other ponies found so uncomfortable about it. But then, the strength of Earth was in his bones. He found them waiting in the clinic, a pair of unicorn mares with a pile of coats and jackets on one of the two high hospital benches. There was a step stool leading right up to the edge, but neither had climbed atop it and neither had the foal between them. He spared little concentration for their appearances beyond what he needed to do his job. He couldn't get a good look at the foal as he came in, but he could see the both of them. One was snow white, the other icy blue. Both had cutie marks, but he didn't really pay attention to either. "Hello." He inclined his head slightly, much more slightly than he ordinarily would. "I'm Dr. Pittman, I'll be assisting you today." He glanced between them, letting his mind lose focus and drift. He nodded abruptly. "Neither of you is my patient." He stepped forward, looking down towards the foal. His breath caught in his throat. Oliver had never even seen a pony this young before, unless he counted the ultrasound. He wasn't entirely sure of what his sense of pony health was telling him as he looked, though the poor thing was clearly sick. Who's this little pony?" He hadn't been training to be a pediatrician or anything, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try his best to smile for the foal. "And what's been bothering her?" "She came down with a fever 2 days ago on the way up here. We aren't sure how she'll react to medicine for humans, so I've just been keeping her as warm and happy as possible." Oliver leaned down, sniffing the child once at a safe distance to see if that might reveal something. It didn't, which meant he would have to do things the old-fashioned way. No magical pony tricks today, it seemed. "That's an understandable worry. For your information, most of the medication I've tested behaves exactly as designed on ponies, once you adjust for a reduced body mass. I wouldn't suggest taking anything prescription without a doctor's consultation first, though." Oliver gestured to the table. "If you could get her up there, I'd like to take a look. First though, has she shown any other symptoms? Maybe, rashes? Vomiting? Coughing? Anything like that?" The mare nodded before her horn lit up with a creamy white glow, unwrapping the foal with her magic and carrying her carefully over to the table before setting her down. "No, other than coughing and sneezing, just the fever." "Starlight, stay still, okay? You need to stay still for the nice doctor." He wasn't really listening after that. His mind was back in the other room, with the patient he had been caring for months. The patient whose insides he had gotten to know far more intimately than he had ever wanted to. His head jerked up as he heard the foal squeak out a high-pitched "Mama's Day." So she was a little older than he had guessed. Or were ponies just fast learners? He watched the mare mother her child, cooing to her and brushing a few loose strands of hair out of her eyes. It took her a moment to get the foal settled, long enough that he started to drift again. All Oliver knew of pony foals he had learned from books, but that didn't really matter. As it turned out, the principle was much the same. He thanked God the foal hadn't suffered some sort of injury he might not have been able to treat. Would his innate magic and connection to the earth be enough to heal a delicate child? He was happy not to find out. He had to climb up onto the step stool, taking the tools he needed from his pockets where he almost never needed them. After less than 5 minutes of gentle poking and prodding, he stepped down with an exasperated sigh. "She's almost certainly caught a cold," he said, with far more annoyance than he ought to. "It's nothing serious. God only knows where she managed to find one, or if it's even really the same disease that people were catching before the event. He turned away, his tail flicking impatiently. Keep her out of the cold, get her plenty of fluids and don't let her be too active. I'll send my receptionist back with some medicine you can give her every few hours to keep the fever down. He started to walk away. Come back if the fever gets worse, or she has trouble breathing, or develops sores. Otherwise, there isn't anything else I can do. He tossed his mask off into the bin along with the gloves, then hurried for the door, his steps getting faster by the moment. He had left his real patient, and for what? A cold? He stopped in the door, then took the walkie-talkie out of his pocket so the unicorns could see. Riley, meet me in the pharmacy. I'm going to need you to fill a prescription for our patient. Wait. He stopped, rolling his eyes as he faced the mares, one silent and one mother. Yes. She stepped over to him and pulled him into a hug. I feel like I interrupted something important, but thank you so much. I don't know if you had children before humanity was changed, she said more then, though he didn't hear it. Didn't, because at that moment she leaned forward and kissed him on the cheek. It had been something about her friend being a dentist. Oliver was stunned, and it seemed for a moment he was about to fall over. Aside from Riley, he hadn't had any meaningful human contact in what felt like months. It was difficult to take in all of it at once. Why, yeah, he stammered. She would probably have been fine. But it was good you came in. Never know until you check. He hurried out the door, without another word. Taking care of Alex had been his whole life, so much so that he hadn't been alive himself. Why did it take a sick foal's mother to remind him of that? How the hell was he supposed to resuscitate Alex if he didn't have any life to share with her? He sang on his way back to the pharmacy, one of the sillier bits of Gilbert and Sullivan he knew. He sang on his way back to Alex's room, one of the love-struck Phantom of the Opera ballads they had always done as a duet. He had to fill in her parts, since she couldn't sing anymore. But that was okay. At least he remembered why he had loved to sing. The world did not change right away. Being more cheerful did not make the work any less difficult, or transform it into something besides work. What it did do, was let Oliver see things differently. He wasn't working because death was his enemy, though that was true enough. He fought because life was precious. As his perspective changed, so did his vision. As Oliver sang, his eyes opened, and he saw he was not alone. He suspected he never had been. The being in the room with him matched the description of no creature he knew. So long as he didn't look directly at her, she seemed a towering woman, taking up an entire corner of the room. A huge curtain of leaves hung behind her instead of hair, and her skin was brown and wrinkled like a tree. Grass grew where she stepped, and little insects buzzed. Yet if he tried to look at her, he found the vision hurt his eyes, and the human illusion broke down. Was that an arm, or the trunk of an elephant? Was her face beautiful, or was a hideous insectoid proboscis poking between her lips? Did those strong legs actually end in reptilian talons? The details didn't stay the same, either. She was not one species, she was all of them. He didn't know how long she had been there, she noticed his attention at once, and chuckled. About time you open your eyes, son. Oliver sat down, lowering his head. He felt like maybe he should bow, but he didn't. After odium, he had a bad taste in his mouth about the practice. Probably would forever. I feel like I should know you. I know my mother though, and you're not her. The figure rolled her eyes, which wouldn't have been so disturbing if she had only had two. She ignored the remark. Perhaps now that you see me, we can accomplish something. You think it's easy to keep her alive when I'm blind? Treading water since November. What are you? He didn't bother with who. Somehow Oliver knew she seemed human to him only because that was what he expected to see. Trying to look her in the face broke down that illusion, and so he made sure not to. She was much easier to look at this way. Her laughter was like birdsong in the hospital room. No, it was an actual bird, a bright red cardinal perched on the windowsill. How had he not noticed it there? A friend. She gestured down at the bed. I may be cruel, but I am also fair. I pay my debts, and I will not allow her to die in my service. Alex served you. Oliver backed away a pace, feeling suddenly sick. The longer he remained, the more he was reminded of odium. Had they been rescued from one monster to fall into the hands of another? She shrugged. Perhaps it's better to say her creation served my purpose. Yours as well. Not every voice need be raised in anger, child. Nor is every creature you do not understand an enemy. What purpose is that? Oliver tried to move protectively between his patient and the stranger, but found her form too vast to approach. He stood beside the bed instead, though he knew if it came to a fight he wouldn't stand a chance. She laughed again, more energetically this time. You have no words for it, not yet. Try. He pulled the rolling bed towards him, drawing in strength through the ground as he always did. It was harder to get it when he was on the second story, or at least he had expected it to be. Not today. The bed rolled with such force it nearly ripped out of its electrical cables, nearly tore away from the floor and crushed him against the back wall. Oliver's strength had not come from straight down, the way he was used to feeling it. It came from right in front of him, in the corner of the room. If the strange figure had even noticed the gesture, she made no sign. Perhaps it would be closest to the truth to say that she is creation's way of being conscious of itself. The universe is vast, yet what good does beauty do if not experienced? She reached down towards the bed. Oliver wanted to resist, but he was paralyzed with fear. His fear was in vain. In the end, she only stroked the little mare's mane out of her eyes, as tenderly as the mother had for her child. Where she touched, the mare seemed less grey, more alive. Still unconscious, but more peacefully asleep instead of comatose. She has been my most successful attempt so far. Not the last. If you think being successful now grants you immortality, talk to the dinosaurs. I would have replaced her in time, as all things must die. Her hands went white, scrunching up the misty fabric of her gown. But my work was not finished. You're not talking about Alex, are you? She just smiled in reply, rising to her full height again. Give me your hoof, child. I still have need of her. I have need of you too. He lifted his right leg, though he didn't offer it to her. She stepped closer, bending down as if to reach. She had a long way to stoop. Don't be afraid, child. You have always served me. In the working of strangers, you now see me with new eyes, but I have always been there. It is not so strange to serve me now. He withdrew, back against the wall. He could go no further, and he nearly collapsed from fear. The spirit, odium, he sounded like that. He wanted our service too. Lightning flashed across that alien face, and for a moment her eyes went darker than any shark's. Do not compare me to that monstrosity. We are nothing alike. He took from you my most precious gift. He gave nothing to the world, only took and took and took from all he touched. Not I. She reached out even further. I take nothing from you, Oliver. I will not take your will, I ask you to use it. Demand, in fact. If all I ever wanted to be was obedient, I never would have needed animals. Still he hesitated, though he lifted up his hoof again. She continued closer. My unwitting allies gave you tools I never imagined. You will make them your own in time, just as you always have. But there is no time. I need her, and to have her I must have you. I cannot speak to the strangers, even if they are more talented with what they call magic. I have tried, yet only you and the sleeping child ever heard me. So hear me now, save my daughter. Oliver looked down at the hoof one last time, then reached up and offered it to the stranger. She took it with her hand, squeezing hard with fingers like pine roots. It hurt so much he screamed. But it didn't matter, it was a good pain. This nameless being needed him to save Alex? That was exactly what he would do. Author's note. Hey every pony! Nearly done with the story, just a little left to go. I'll talk about the sequel in the A/N for the last chapter, so I won't bore you with it now. Fun fact, had some guest characters appear in this chapter, not for the first time in this series, but certainly it's pretty rare. In this case, the crossover characters are from this story. Just wonder I guess? End author's note.